Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for logging on and joining us for another event in our series, The Souls of Black Folk, reading essays, literature, and so forth. We've had a great time over the past couple of sessions that we've had. We do these about once a month. And so for the month of March, we have a particular session on Audre Lorde that I know is going to be fantastic and spectacular and everything, especially with the lineup that we have. Um, we have two more of these that I want to tell you about before we begin. On April 28th, we have a session on the Harlem Renaissance, and that will be conducted by Corey Barnes in the philosophy department, as well as Farah Karaptian in the art architecture and art history department. And on May 5th, we'll have a sort of exploration of the Black arts movement brought to you by Angela Nurse in sociology, as well as myself in theology and religious studies. So once again, thank you for joining us. And I know this is going to be a lot of fun. Let me first introduce our speakers. For the first person I'll introduce will be Dr. TJ Tallie in the history department, who started in the fall of 2018. He specializes in comparative settler colonial and imperial history with a special attention on South Africa. His interests include, or broadly defined, involve colonialism, gender and racial identity, indigeneity, as well as religious expression. He teaches courses on African history, global history, Pacific history, gender, as well as sexuality. On top of that, global indigenous studies, as well as British imperialism, queer theory, and he doesn't have it listed, but I will add medieval thought as well. So thank you for joining us, Professor Tallie. And we also have Dr. Jillian Tullis, who's an associate professor in the Department of Communication. Her teaching and research focuses on health communication, specifically communication about dying and death in healthcare settings. And she has been here since, I believe, 2015. So for today, we'll be talking about Audre Geraldine Lorde, who is an icon in Black thought, Black feminist thought, Black queer thought. She holds a special place across numerous disciplines, across numerous progressive ways of thinking about and reimagining the world that we live in. She was born 1934, died at the age of 58 in 1992. She was a writer by way of being a poet, an essayist, a short story writer, as well as a librarian. She is described as a Black lesbian mother warrior poet. So we begin with Professor Tallie, and then I believe we will conclude with Professor Tullis, and then we'll open up the floor for questions.
Thank you so much. This is exciting, and I'm super thrilled. So one of those this is such a great bridge moment, right? To just be at the end of Black History Month, and as we enter into sort of Women's History Month. And I feel like not only would Audre Lorde have smiled at that, she would have had a sort of snarky witticism about being pigeonholed in either of these categories, and then would have made me feel deeply embarrassed. But one of the things that I love so much as a Black queer thinker, as a Black queer scholar, about and thinking with Audre Lorde is in her extraordinary sharpness and incisiveness for thinking about how complicated things need to be and how multifaceted and multi-sided things are. And so one of the things that's sort of incredible is that Audre Lorde, at sort of her academic writing height in the 1970s and 1980s, was this extraordinarily well-known, gifted, and deeply combative author who proudly stood in these intersections before intersectionality was a well-coined phrase by another Black woman, Kimberly Crenshaw, in 1989. Before this, Audre Lorde is saying, look, I'm Black, I'm a woman, I'm a lesbian, I'm all of these things simultaneously. And if you don't like it, you're gonna have to deal with it, right? For her, explicitly, these identities were simultaneous. They were non-negotiable. She's, of course, best known for saying that we do not lead single issue lives. There's no such thing as a single issue struggle as a result. And so she challenged and pushed all of her contemporaries, those in the women's studies movement, those in civil rights movements, those who were fellow poets, to think through the multiple ambits and the ways that things are working. And so I wanted to speak about her specifically, and then I wanted to read some small selections from her that I think will be really important and powerful. Audre Lorde was uncompromising in recognizing multiplicity complexity, and diversity. And I don't mean that in the sort of TM university form. I mean diversity in the fact that there are multiple permutations about how diversity forces us to think about ourselves and our universal perspectives. And so as a queer thinker, as a woman, and as a Black woman, Audre Lorde insisted that each of these were specific and meaningful and had to be addressed, both within herself and within her readers and listeners. And so for me, as a Black queer person, but not a woman, right, as a cisgender man, I find that Audre Lorde affirms and simultaneously deeply challenges me as a thinker. She reminds me of ways in which my body is ignored. She reminds me of ways in which I have to struggle to be recognized or seen or understood. And then she very slyly reminds me of ways in which casually every day, I can also be a participant in forms of erasure, right? And so this is one of the gifts that Audre Lorde gives us, is the sense of how does one ruthlessly, constantly, critically see one's relationship to power and also invite other people into that process. And so as a Black queer historian, Audre Lorde is a figure that is both terrifying and deeply inspirational to me. And so here at USD, I have the opportunity to teach a class that I deeply love called Queering Colonialism. How do we think about gender, sexuality, and the body? How do we think about how those histories have brought us here? And so students not only read a variety of third world women's writing and Black queer writing. They'll read a bridge called This Bridge Called My Back. They'll read plenty of Black feminist writing, but we really spend a lot of time, not only in her seminal book, Zami, but really in Sister Outsider. And so I wanted to read two selections from Sister Outsider today and think about the power that she brings to them. So I'm going to be reading a few short bits from her piece, The Uses of the Erotic. And then I want to actually read in its entirety because it is fiery and uncomfortable. The Master's Tools will not dismantle the Master's house. So I think that these are both important. And I really want to just briefly go into the uses of the erotic and then think about what might be ways for us to keep in mind how we may be invested in the idea of the same tools that may marginalize or oppress us, the same tools that give us a sense of feeling like we don't belong, that once we get just an inch, once we get like a minute in this space, feeling like we've made it, how do we sometimes forget that very process that made us feel marginalized now that we've made it? And I think that's the power of this piece from Audre Lorde, the second piece, because she calls us out and gently reminds us that momentary acceptance is not the same thing as actual transformation. So I'm going to read a few bits from the uses of the erotic. We'll pause, and then we'll move over to the Master's Tools. All right? Okay. I like how I asked for like some sort of agreement as if I was not going to do this anyway. So it feels very Audre Lorde. All right, so from Sister Outsider, I'm going to read a few selections from the uses of the erotic as power. There are many kinds of power, used and unused, acknowledged or otherwise. The erotic is a resource within each of us that lies in a deeply female and spiritual plane, firmly rooted in the power of our unexpressed or unrecognized feeling. In order to perpetuate itself, every oppression must corrupt or distort those various sources of power within the culture of the oppressed that can provide energy for change. For women, this has meant a suppression of the erotic as a considered source of power and information within our lives. We've been taught to suspect this resource vilified, abused, and devalued within Western society. On the other hand, the superficially erotic has been encouraged as a sign of female inferiority. On the other hand, women have been made to suffer and to feel both contemptible and suspect by virtue of its existence. It is a short step from there to the false belief that only by the suppression of the erotic within our lives and consciousness can women be truly strong. But that strength is illusory, for it is fashioned within the context of male models of power. The erotic has been misnamed by men and used against women. It has been made into the confused, the trivial, the psychotic, the plasticized sensation. For this reason, we have often turned away from the exploration and consideration of the erotic as a source of power and information, confusing it with its opposite, the pornographic. But pornography is a direct denial of the power of the erotic, for it represents the suppression of true feeling. Pornography emphasizes sensation without feeling. The erotic is a measure between the beginnings of our sense of self and the chaos of our strongest feelings. It is an internal sense of satisfaction to which, once we have experienced it, we know we can aspire. For having experienced the fullness of this depth of feeling and recognizing its power in honor and self-respect, we can require no less of ourselves. The aim of each thing which we do is to make our lives and the lives of our children richer and more possible. Within the celebration of the erotic in all our endeavors, my work becomes a conscious decision, a longed for bed which I enter gratefully and from which I rise up empowered. Now, of course, women so empowered are dangerous. So we are taught to separate the erotic demand from most vital areas of our lives other than sex. And the lack of concern for the erotic root and satisfactions of our work is felt in our disaffection from so much of what we do. For instance, how often do we really love our work even at its most difficult? The very word erotic comes from the Greek word eros, the personification of love in all its aspects, born of chaos and personifying creative power and harmony. When I speak of the erotic, then, I speak of it as the assertion of the life force of women, of that creative energy empowered, the knowledge and use of which we are now reclaiming in our language, our history, our dancing, our loving, our work, our lives. There are frequent attempts to equate pornography and eroticism, two diametrically opposed uses of the sexual. Because of these attempts, it has become fashionable to separate the spiritual from the political, to see them as contradictory and antithetical. What do you mean, a poetic revolutionary? A meditating gun runner? In the same way, we have attempted to separate the spiritual and the erotic, thereby reducing the spiritual to a world of flattened affect, a world of the aesthetic who aspires to feel nothing. But nothing is farther from the truth. For the aesthetic position is one of the highest fear, the gravest immobility, and severe abstinence of the aesthetic becomes the ruling obsession. And it is one not of self-discipline, but self-abnegation. And finally here, the erotic functions for me in several ways. And the first is in providing the power which comes from sharing deeply any pursuit with another person. The sharing of joy, whether physical, emotional, psychic, or intellectual, forms a bridge between the sharers, which can be the basis for understanding much of what is not shared between them, and lessens the threat of their difference. Okay, so I think that one of the things that I love so much about this is that the erotic is deeply powerful. It can be reclaimed. It is extraordinarily a power for women in a male-dominated society. And I think that sometimes it gets very easily bundled up, like so many other things we do for Audre Lorde, into a sort of generic Etsy-based tonic of self-care. Like we've said, like, go discover your erotic by finding your happy place today. And I think Audre Lorde would laugh at you. I think instead she was like, the erotic is a meaningful, disruptive, powerful source that you can find within yourself that is not to be reduced merely to sort of sexual power or titillation, or something that can be flattened out, but instead it is something that is accessible and transformative. And so I don't want to give you some sort of like meaningless homily of like, go find your erotic today, right? Instead, think about the fact that that power is meaningful and transformative and already exists. And there are ways in which you can think about it and which you can have access to thinking about its transformative radical potential. Okay, all right. So I did want to then transition over to the piece that when I first read it, I was a deeply pretentious 16-year-old, and I had opened this piece, and I was sitting on my mom's couch, and I was like, oh, damn. And my mom came home, and she was like, what's wrong? And I was like, I've read some Audre Lorde. And she was like, oh, no. She's like, which one? And I was like, Master's Tools. And she was like, okay, baby. Because for me, this was one of those things that I keep coming back to. I'm like, how do I get out of the same systems that I want to succeed in? How do I think about the ways in which I may be complicit in so many types of violence? So it's a relatively short piece and we're going to go through it together, okay? I agreed to take part in a New York University lecture for the Humanities Conference a year ago, with the understanding that I would be commenting upon papers dealing with the role of difference within the lives of American women, difference of race, sexuality, class, and age. The absence of these considerations weakens any feminist discussion of the personal and the political. It is a particular academic arrogance to assume any discussion of feminist theory without examining our many differences and without a significant input from poor women, Black and third world women, and lesbians. And yet, I stand here as a Black lesbian feminist, having been invited to comment within the only panel at this conference where the input of Black feminists and lesbians is represented. What this says about the vision of this conference is sad. In a country where racism, sexism, and homophobia are inseparable. To read this program is to assume that lesbian and Black women have nothing to say about existentialism, the erotic, women's culture and silence, developing feminist theory, or heterosexuality and power. And what does it mean in personal and political terms when even the 2 Black women who did present here were literally found at the last hour? What does it mean when the tools of a racist patriarchy are used to examine the fruits of that same patriarchy? It means that only the most narrow perimeters of change are possible and allowable. The absence of any consideration of lesbian consciousness or the consciousness of third world women leaves a serious gap within this conference and within the papers presented here. For example, in a paper on material relationships between women, I was conscious of an either-or model of nurturing, which either totally dismissed my knowledge as a Black lesbian. In this paper, there was no examination of mutuality between women, no systems of shared support, no interdependence as exists between lesbians and women-identified women. Yet it is only in the patriarchal model of nurturance that women who, quote, attempt to emancipate themselves pay perhaps too high a price for the results, as this paper states. For women, the need and desire to nurture each other is not pathological but redemptive. And it is within that knowledge that our real power is rediscovered. It is this real connection which is so feared by a patriarchal world. Only within a patriarchal structure is maternity the only social power open to women. Interdependency between women is the way to a freedom which allows the I to be, not in order to be used, but in order to be creative. This is a difference between the passive be and the active being. Advocating the mere tolerance of difference between women is the grossest reformism. It is a total denial of the creative function of difference in our lives. Difference must be not merely tolerated, but seen as a fund of necessary polarities between which our creativity can spark like a dialectic. Only then does the necessity for interdependency become unthreatening. Only within that interdependency of different strengths, acknowledged and equal, can the power to seek new ways of being in the world generate, as well as the courage and sustenance to act where there are no charters. Within the interdependence of mutual, non-dominant differences lies that security which enables us to descend into the chaos of knowledge and return with true visions of our future, along with the concomitant power to effect those changes which can bring that future into being. Difference is that raw and powerful connection from which our personal power is forged. As women, we have been taught to ignore our differences or to view them as causes for separation and suspicion rather than as forces for change. Without community, there is no liberation, only the most vulnerable and temporary armistice between an individual and her oppression. But community must not mean a shedding of our differences, nor the pathetic pretense that those differences do not exist. Those of us who stand outside the circle of this society's definition of acceptable women, those of us who have been forged in the crucibles of difference, those of us who are poor, who are lesbians, who are Black, who are older, know that survival is not an academic skill. It is learning how to stand alone, unpopular and sometimes reviled, and how to make common cause with those others identified as outside the structures in order to define and seek a world in which we can all flourish. It is learning how to take our differences and make them strengths, for the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. They may allow us temporarily to beat him at his own game, but they will never enable us to bring about genuine change. And this fact is only threatening to those women who still define the master's house as their only source of support. Poor women and women of color know there is a difference between the daily manifestations of marital slavery and prostitution, because it is our daughters who line 42nd Street. If white American feminist theory need not deal with the differences between us and the resulting difference in our oppressions, then how do you deal with the fact that the women who clean your houses and tend your children while you attend conferences on feminist theory are, for the most part, poor women and women of color? What is the theory behind racist feminism? In a world of possibility for us all, our personal visions help lay the groundwork for political action. The failure of academic feminists to recognize difference as a crucial strength is a failure to reach beyond the first patriarchal lesson. In our world, divide and conquer must become define and empower. Why weren't other women of color invited to participate in this conference? Why were the 2 phone calls to me considered a consultation? Am I the only possible source of names of Black feminists? And although the Black panelist paper ends on an important and powerful connection of love between women, what about interracial cooperation between feminists who don't love each other? In academic feminist circles, the answer to these questions is often, we didn't know who to ask. But that is the same evasion of responsibility, the same cop-out that keeps Black women's art out of women's exhibitions, Black women's work out of most feminist publications, except for the occasional special third world women's issue, and Black women's texts off your reading lists. But as Adrienne Rich pointed out in a recent talk, white feminists have educated themselves about such an enormous amount over the past 10 years. How come you haven't also educated yourself about Black women and the differences between us, white and Black, when it is key to our survival as a movement? Women of today are still being called upon to stretch across the gap of male ignorance and to educate men as our existence and our needs. This is an old and primary tool of all oppressors to keep the oppressed occupied with the master's concerns. Now we hear that it is the task of women of color to educate white women in the face of tremendous resistance as to our existence, our differences, our relative roles in our joint survival. This is a diversion of energies and a tragic repetition of racist patriarchal thought. Simone de Beauvoir once said, "It is in the knowledge of the genuine conditions of our lives that we must draw our strength to live and our reasons for acting." Racism and homophobia are real conditions of all our lives in this place and time. I urge each one of us here to reach down into that deep place of knowledge inside herself and touch that terror and loathing of any difference that lives here. See whose face it wears. Then the personal, as the political, can begin to illuminate all our choices. Thank you so much. I'm happy to talk more in the Q&A.
All right, so I'm going to try to work off of what Professor Tallie just spoke about in terms of difference and look at the cancer journals from Audre Lorde. I am going to start by talking a little bit about what I do as a way to kind of get us thinking about Lorde. Okay, so as Professor Calloway mentioned at the introduction, I do teach health communication, and I do teach and research about how people talk about dying and death. And so unlike Professor Tallie, I came to Audre Lorde's work, not when I was 16, but sadly when I was in my 40s. So as it relates to health communication, I kept, her name comes up all the time when we think about cancer, when we think about choice, and we think about health. So what is health communication? I'll just give you a very quick little primer about it. So in my classes, we focus on messages about health, any messages about health. And we spend a lot of time looking at things like language, because when it comes to serious illness, a lot of times we just don't have like the perfect word. Unlike the Germans, we have to use things like metaphor to help us when we want to talk about things like pain or suffering. And so we pay a lot of attention to metaphor. And so Audre Lorde, as a poet, is very good at language and at metaphor. But also for my work in particular, I'm really interested in narrative and the use of stories as a way of knowing, as a type of knowledge. So we're going to spend a little bit of time with her story. So let me give you some context for understanding the cancer journals. And I'm working from a special edition of her cancer journals that were published in 1997. So it's important to know when I start talking about her experience and when I read some of her passages, that shame and stigma of cancer were very real at the time. They were very real. She was diagnosed in 1978, which was the same year that Susan Sontag's book, Illness as Metaphor, came out, where Sontag really interrogates the war metaphors and war language around a disease like cancer. So shame and stigma, it's significant. People are keeping a cancer diagnosis sometimes a secret. This writing that Lorde did, it predates Susan G. Komen Foundation, which everybody knows. We can thank them for the pink ribbon, and I'm happy to talk about my critiques of that organization if we want at the end. But we also have HMOs are on the rise. They existed even in the 20s and 30s, but they're becoming more popular in the 70s, thanks to Richard Nixon. And women are working, feminists in particular, are fighting for less paternalism in medicine. They want things, for example, like to have a choice, that they don't wake up and find that their breasts are gone because the surgeon has discovered that they have cancer. They want to be able to choice in that process. They want things like lumpectomies over mastectomies, right? So they want to have just the tumor in the breast removed as opposed to the entire breast removed. And I think it's important to also keep in mind that Black women were and still are dying at higher rates from breast cancer than their white counterparts. So I think that's an important thing to think about in the context of what we're going to discuss now. So what is it that, and I'm going to focus on one small portion of the larger cancer journals. I'm going to focus specifically on Lorde's conversation about the use of prosthetics. Okay, so she has had surgery. You have to imagine the situation. She has had surgery. It's a couple of days post mastectomy. So she had her right breast removed and she is back in the clinic, and she has a volunteer from an organization called Reach for Recovery that is encouraging her to wear a prosthetic breast form. So what you're looking at here is an example of that. Women were wearing pieces of wool in their bras as a way to look like they had two breasts, okay? And it's only been a couple of days, and Lorde is getting pressure to do this, right? And she's not feeling good about this pressure. And she says, something is really wrong here. Like, I haven't even had time to really process what I'm going through. And now I'm being asked to wear this prosthesis, okay? So what is her reaction to this? She says, and I'm going to read, so I'm going to apologize in advance for reading some long quotes, but I don't want, I'm feeling already guilty about the fact that I have to take some of her wonderful words out of their context, but I'm going to read to you anyway, so bear with me. So she's grappling with this idea, like her appearance matters more, right? This is the message that she's getting from this volunteer. You need to wear the breast form. Even when she goes to the surgeon's office, she's being pressured by the staff there to not make the other women who are in the clinic and in the doctor's office feel uncomfortable because she doesn't look quote unquote normal. So she's saying in her writing in the Cancer Journal, she says, a lifetime of loving women had taught me that when women love each other, physical change does not alter that love. She said, it did not occur to me that anyone who really loved me would love me any less because I had one breast instead of two. She said, although it did occur to me to wonder if they would be able to love and deal with the new me. So she's grappling with this idea that she is her. She says, I still felt like myself. She says, I still felt like myself. I still felt like Audre, but I'm clearly different. I'm clearly changed in some way. And she goes on to say that the emphasis on cosmetic reinforces this society's stereotype of women, that we are only what we look or appear. So this is in the only aspect of our existence we need to address. Any woman who had a breast removed because of cancer knows she does not feel the same. She says, but we are allowed no psychic time or space to examine what our true feelings are, to make them our own. She says, with this quick cosmetic reassurance, we're told our feelings are not important. Our appearance is all the sum total of self. She is hypercritical. She really, I mean, when you read the Cancer Journal, she is pissed. There's no other way to put it. She's angry about this, and she's angry about the pressure because she recognizes the inherent sexism in focusing only on a woman's appearance. She says, this is just sexism. This is just privileging the male gaze, right? This is just making women feel as if they're nothing more than their looks. And so she's very, very critical of this. Okay, so what else does she have to say about this experience? What are some other insights that we can gain? What are other things that we can get from her story? She talks about really the value, I think, of community and support and things like visibility and invisibility. So for her, she says, you know, if we're not given this time to process what is happening, that we're going to have an issue, right? We're going to have an issue for ourselves. And we need the support of other women around us. We need to be seen by other women in order to get the support that we need in order to heal and to be whole and to be made whole. So she says, prosthesis, this is a longer quote. She says, prosthesis offers the empty comfort of no one will know the difference. But it is that very difference which I wish to affirm because I have lived it and survived it and wish to share that strength with other women. If we are to translate the silence surrounding breast cancer into language and action against this scourge, then the first step is that women with mastectomies must become visible to each other. For silence and visibility go hand in hand with powerlessness. We reinforce our isolation and invisibility from each other, as well as the false complacency of a society, which would rather face the results of its own insanities. In addition, we withhold that visibility and support from one another, which is such an aid to perspective and self-acceptance. Surrounded by other women day by day, all of whom appear to have two breasts, it is very difficult sometimes to remember that I am not alone. Yet once I face death as a life process, what is there possibly left for me to fear? Who can ever really have power over me again? So she wants you to see her. She wants other women to see her so that they can come together in support of each other. If every woman she sees has two breasts, how will she know who her best means of support are? How can she offer support to other women that are in her sphere, right? And so she wants to be seen. But she wants not like the kind of typical gaze that is about a particular type of beauty, a particular singular type of beauty, right? That is probably, I would say most certainly white and skinny, for example, right? She's saying, no, I want to be seen in this way. And because I want to own this. I want to own this illness. And I want to feel not as if I am weak, but as if I can be empowered by it. And I think this is a very different perspective than what we often hear in terms of a cancer narrative. So even 40 years later, I think that this is something that I think we're still grappling with in our culture, right? And I think it's a powerful message. So I want to just give you a chance to look and to see and to make her visible, her body visible. So she says that a mastectomy is not a guilty act that must be hidden in order for me to regain acceptance or protect the sensibilities of others. She says pretense has never brought about lasting change or progress. And I think this is a really important, I mean, I think this idea about pretense, about as if we can just act like something is not true or act as if certain things are true, just will allow things to be changed, I think is something that is really valuable in the context of illness, in the context of serious illness, right? And I think there's a particular power in that acknowledgement. Plus, we're talking about this idea that people should not feel guilt or shame because of what is happening with their body or their efforts to save their lives or an effort to feel whole and healed. Right. Okay, so what are my kind of takeaways? I have like blown through this like a lot faster than I would like, mostly because there's no good way for me to give you all of the greatness that is just even this little chapter in the Cancer Journal. So just to kind of circle back around to some of the observations, I think that Audre Lorde gives us some really great examples of what resistance looks like in healthcare contexts, because I think it is easy to assume that, and this happens in medicine often, that if someone doesn't want to conform, that they're being difficult. Physicians even describe their patients as being difficult patients, right? But for a woman to say, I want to walk around and make it known that I have one breast and not two, is not to be non-compliant, is not to be in violation of some best practices of medicine, right? She's saying, no, there's something else happening here. This is a social issue that we should be confronting. It tells us something about about how we treat women in this culture, right? She also gives us some things to think about in terms of choice in healthcare contexts. We've already talked about identity, right? What does it mean to be a whole person? What does it mean to be a woman, a sick woman, a woman who wants to survive and thrive? And I think that she gives us some lessons about time, that this doesn't, why does this have to be fast, right? Why does this have to be fast? And the thing that I ask my students is, who is served by that speed, right? Who is served by saying, in 2 days, you must be wearing a prosthetic. You can't even process this illness. She says time and healing and wholeness are important goals, right? Not satisfying patriarchy and the status quo, right? I think also when I read her work, even when I read her work about having breast cancer and reading about, she eventually had metastases to her liver, even reading about her experience having liver cancer or cancer in her liver, she, I think, really tells us something about what embodied knowing and questioning look like. So when she has this moment that feels not right, she trusts that moment. She trusts that, and she takes the time to interrogate that. I think I want to just really emphasize, when I read also her work, the ways in which it's very clear that she loves and respects women and values community really comes through. And so I like, look out for the women in your lives, look out for each other, right? We're only as strong as the women next to us. And I think really the last 2 points are particularly salient for me in my work around end of life, dying, and death. But that silence that sometimes comes from stigma and shame can be isolating, but it can also be very deadly. It can kill, right? It can be the cause of someone's death. And I think finally, just allow people to be seen, right? Allow people to be seen, allow people to be visible. Put your own anxieties about that to the side and allow somebody to be seen, because it is essential and critical and important. Thank you.
Very much. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Tullis, and thank you, Professor Tallie. Of course, I could have 1,000 questions to pose to them, but I want to leave room for people who are watching, people who are here, students, staff, faculty, so forth. Any questions for both or either of our guest speakers for today?
I have a question for Tullis, Jillian. You mentioned you were teaching death and dying. I'm currently in the class, so it's more so a question on, do you think, I know with the cancer journals, Audre Lorde like wrote about her journey. Do you think she ever came to terms with the fact that she was gonna die? Or like, is that seen within her writing?
This is a really interesting question, because so 6 years after her mastectomy, on like around like about 2 weeks after her 50th birthday, she found out that she had cancer, that she had some type of mass in her liver. And then eventually it took, I mean, I'm reading that about that now. So it took her about 2 years before she really truly accepted that there was in fact, that mass was in fact cancer. And so I'm reading this thinking, okay, is she denying it? Is she accepting it? And she goes back and forth, like sometimes where she says, if this mass is really truly cancer, then I will deal with it. But what she ultimately says is like, I have work to do, right? I have work to do. I have things to write. I have things to say. And in fact, I wrote down a quote. She says, I am saving my life by using my life in the service of what must be done. Right. So she is still ultimately, and then later she says, how will I be allowed to live my life for the rest of my life? So there are moments when you think, okay, she's kind of there thinking that my life is going to be limited by this disease. And then other moments where that's not the case. But that over and over again, what I do see is so far in that writing is that she feels it's motivating. It's a motivating force for her to keep doing the work that she's doing, for her to keep elevating the voice of Black women, of lesbian women, of Black lesbian women. Like, she's really working on that. So I don't know. I'm not there yet to know. I haven't gotten that far in my reading of her work to know if she truly accepts it, but she does see it as a motivating force.
Do you know if she had a position or opinion, or what do you think her position or opinion would be towards women who, I guess, express themselves, have a physical manifestation of embracing their erotic through the way they look, the way they dress, the way they present themselves, you know, kind of framing that maybe in today's society and entertainment, especially where women say that they're taking ownership of their bodies and it's empowering for them, and therefore they can present themselves any way that they feel like makes them feel empowered. Do you think that she accepted that and understood that? Or do you think that she would have felt that they're just kind of playing into the patriarchal narrative of beauty?
Right. I think that one of the things about that is that would be a really complex question, right? And I want to talk very briefly. I'd much rather hear about Dr. Tullis about this, because I think one of the things that Audre Lorde would point out is like, why is this man talking? So I'm going to say real fast, one thing that I think would be interesting would be, I think that she would have a multi-sided approach, right? She would be like, we need to think about what tools we have and how we survive. When she says survival is not an academic skill, right? She's like, how do you find and celebrate and use difference in a certain way? But one might also read on some level the master's tools as a critique in the idea that one can just say that a type of capitalist commodification of your body somehow is going to bring about transformation, right? So she could be also critical of the idea that being able to market yourself is freedom, right? On some level, she'd be like, are you also still investing in a system in which you are being commodified, right? And yet she'd also probably say very critically, like, there is a moment where we need to celebrate both women's autonomy, but also be critical of the ways in which that autonomy is gained. And I'm gonna stop talking about women right now.
It's not an easy question to answer. One, because I mean, my first thought when you asked the question was that if something like a woman's appearance was really for erotic and like in the way that Professor Tallie spoke about it, that perhaps it would be acceptable, right? If it was in the service of yourself, then perhaps it would be possible. But I think there's a lot to be interrogated about, like about the emphasis on things like makeup and clothing and certain types of clothing that can't be ignored, right? That perhaps those standards and expectations still ultimately come from patriarchal ideas, right? And so, I mean, yeah, I don't have a better answer. Yeah.
I'm interested in what you think about Lorde's perspective on sex and women, and particularly how she, at least from Dr. Tallie's positioning of eroticism being a creative energy for women, does she write about sex outside of the binary? And how can that empowered eroticism happen for, well, I don't know if she would say anything about trans individuals, or, you know, I'm just curious how that eroticism is theorized and how woman is theorized and that relationship between them. I'll leave it at that.
And I think that's super hard, right? In some ways too, because Audre Lorde's writing is simultaneously deeply emphatic and powerful now, and also very 1977. And by this, I mean, not that it's dated, but I mean that there is a very specific project that is happening in women's studies between 1975 and 1985, right? And I would argue that it is a moment of saying, hi, men, you have been here for so long, so much, so many men thoughts, right? And actually instead, maybe we can hear from women, and the mobilization of the concept of women, even to open that concept up to suddenly not be about this one. And so it sounds sometimes, I think, especially in 2021, really binarized, right? Talking about women's power, women's essence, women's authority. But I think there's in a moment in the 1970s, there's also something very significant about that. I think there is a gesturing towards the openness and the potential once the sort of universal lock of patriarchy is sort of shattered. So I think part of that is written as a response to sort of universal patriarchy. And yet it is a lot of writing that is in women's studies movements about reclaiming like agency, reclaiming actually voices for women, like pointing out the ways in which this discourse has been so male dominated. And so I think that thinking about it in 2021, it does, I think that possibility exists. And I think that possibility is gestured towards in her writing. And I think also there would be a moment where one can read Audre Lorde, especially in thinking about the understanding and the need for physical difference as opposed to conformity, especially I think what Dr. Tullis said so on the cancer journals. I think Audre Lorde would have no patience for TERFs in a certain way, right? And the phrase TERF, for those who aren't familiar, is a exclusionary radical feminist, one that it implies a sort of biological unity or essentialism for women. And I think she would be like, women is different, right? And I think that's one thing that we have seen extensively, she writes about, women is different. There are extensive types of difference that are powerful and that we can lean into. And when she says at that very end, right, like, I urge each one of us here to reach down into that deep place of knowledge inside herself and touch that terror and loathing of any difference that lives there. See whose face it wears. Would I love to see Audre Lorde say that to J.K. Rowling's face? Yes, right? But thinking about that explicitly as a moment of, what are the moments in which you, to mobilize a particular type of feminist identity, then require a denigration or erasure of other women? Because I think she would say, this is a community of women. These are trans women. How do you not see that this difference is also part of who we are? And again, I think that would flow into thinking about non-conforming, gender non-conforming and non-binary people. And I think that's one potential. It's so hard, right? Because we lost her in 1992. And so some of these terms and ideas, or some of these expressions, I don't think are there in a way explicitly, but I think that emphasis on difference and yet finding the power in that, and then going back to thinking about sex and the erotic, right, is that sex can be this sort of reclaiming, and it's not necessarily just for male views, but patriarchy doesn't need to just have men, right? And she's arguing this, right, that like there are plenty of women who are deeply invested in the patriarchy, which is what she's arguing when she talks about the master's tools will not dismantle this house, right? So she's like, finding that creativity, finding that connection, finding that power in sex can absolutely be open to other bodies, I think. I do think that she would politely side on me for talking so much, so I'm gonna take a minute back.
I was just kind of curious about the response of other feminists at this time to kind of her views and writings, because I know, unfortunately, some of her views were more controversial and I guess different for the time.
It was wild, right? So on some levels, right, there was deep offense, right? There was, how dare you? How dare you take away, this is unity. We are fighting against patriarchy. How dare you interrupt us, right? And again, one of the things that's really frustrating is that so many of these conversations are so repetitively unimaginative and sound exactly like what you hear in 2021. I'm trying to stand with you, but you're not letting me be an ally, right? I would like to be more involved, but you are the one shutting me down, right? And so Audre Lorde definitely had immense pushback, I think explicitly from some white feminists who did feel affronted, right? They're like, how dare you disunify this movement? And there were some who were like, our goal is to fight for recognition, right? And to make space. And I think that challenge there is there. But at the same time, right, there were other white women who were like, yes, right? And I think that she, interestingly enough, right, her becoming essential in a pantheon is also so wild, right? It's because she is, if you were to think of the, like, if there's a women's studies or feminist studies pantheon of sort of like a canon, she's there. And so I think part of that is because she continuously makes people uncomfortable and challenges and finds that moment of what does it mean to do women's work, to do queer work, to do Black work, to do third world work, to do child of immigrant work, right? Because Audre Lorde herself was also the child of Caribbean immigrants. So her Blackness was also unique and intersectional in her own ways too. I think it's a great question. And I would sometimes give my eye teeth to have been someone quietly not speaking in a women's study, in an NWSA, National Women's Studies Association conference in 1979. Because what I read you, like the Master's Tools, is also at its heart, Audre Lorde being real mad at like white peopling, right? And sort of being like, I don't understand. I just why there's not any more Black people. We tried. And so part of that is like her calling some righteous fury on everybody, but then also inviting people into that. And so I think some people responded really well. Like she and Adrienne Rich were like this. So there are some moments in which there was real collaboration, but always that tension, which is a real model for what I think so many of us want to be as scholars. So someone that's like, that person makes me think, and I'm a little scared of them, but I'm also really excited to be in conversation with them. It's like 80% of how I feel with doctors Tullis and Calloway. So it works out real well.
You know what's interesting is that I'm reading the selected works of Audre Lorde, and she says, I said in that speech that I was Black lesbian feminist, and she said, and I was scared to do it, but that's why I had to do it. You know, so I mean, that kind of like, she's just a badass, right? I mean, that kind of courage and that kind of like fierce, like she was just fierce, and she said, no, I have to do it because it is scary, right? Because, and that tells me it's the right thing to do. I think that is like if we could all just rise to that, right? What could we accomplish?
This is a question more towards Dr. Tullis, but so you talked about how she was kind of passionate about destigmatizing like a physical illness. And I was wondering what you'd say that her response would be to today of kind of the theme of destigmatizing mental illness and what her approach and view on that would be, since it's kind of different of like, you can't show the physical difference of having a mental illness compared to her being like having one breast instead of two. So I was kind of curious about that.
My first thought was just that I think she would want to destigmatize it, but I think she would also be looking very much to her community, like to her community of people as a form of support. Not to say that she wouldn't want the structures changed, right? The systemic stuff around mental illness changed, but I think there would be she would have a lot to say about community, right? That's like kind of my first thought. Just given the ways in which she talks about her own like feelings of isolation or her own anxiety or her own grief when she's going through particularly her liver cancer experience. She was in Switzerland sometimes, in New York sometimes, and so away from like her core support of people. So my sense is that would be really invaluable. She would probably say we need more communities of support, right? For sure. That's just my first thought.
Both of these presentations were wonderful, and I, absolutely adore Audre Lorde. So the programming is fantastic. I wonder for our students, for everybody, when you read those passages from Lorde, when I read those passages, I often get a little depressed, and it's mostly because, as you are noting, this is 1979, and for those of you who don't go to academic conferences, these things are still happening today. Regardless of your discipline, folks are still having to announce that our interests are not just niche interests, but belong in the broader discipline. So all of this is say, sorry, I start going on a rant and then I can just keep going. But I wonder how we might think of Lorde's words as having inspired certainly change and hope and, a sort of more positive way than my sort of curmudgeon-y depression when I think, Jesus, nothing has changed in the last 40 some years, right? Are there ways in which you see, and you can maybe name for many of us here, like the influence that Lorde has had and continues to have, and ways in which, we can hear this letter and, not feel like we are stuck in 1979. I know that's a big ask, so just any kind of thoughts that you either Professor Tullis or Tallie have on that.
I wish I had like a perfectly packaged, like hopeful message to answer this question, because it is startling, even reading the cancer journals, how unfortunately the same a lot of what she's talking about is. So I was having this kind of thought to myself today, like, how can I end on a positive note? How can I say something that's like affirming, so part of me thinks, well, her work, she believed that her work would live beyond her, and that as long as we're still picking up her work, we can still use her work in service of making change. And I would love if I could say none of these things that she's written about still are true. But if I feel a little bit hopeful that at least, maybe we're on the right track and that we have like some roadmap, because one of the things that she says is like, If we wait for the feminist move, if we think the feminist movement doesn't respond to the current times and that's going to work, we're not going to get anywhere, right? So I take that little thing and I put it in my cap and think, okay, we got to move with the times, right? That's what she would say. And maybe that's an answer to the question that Dr. Keeling asked earlier about non-binary people, right? It's like we have to stay with the times. And so I think if nothing else, we need to keep reading her work and keep using her work and keep citing her work. And so that's maybe where I feel a little bit of like, she's given us the map in some ways. We just have to take it and roll with it. Is that helpful?
Yeah, I love that. And I mean, Dr. Manna, you're so right, right? It is one of those things that you read it and it's just so frustrating because you're like, oh, it's Wednesday. But it's interesting because I think that Audre Lorde comes with a lot of, she has a particular level of despairing rage that is deeply mixed with hope that only the deluded and academic can truly have, which I think is very specifically the idea that we keep doing this because we hope that there is transformative potential, right? And I think that, for example, that is one of the things I see most clearly, for example, in your, Peter, your praxis is like absolutely this already, right? It is pointing out deep structural oppression and nonsense in the hope that there is the meaningful transformation. And I do see that sometimes in Audre Lorde's work, like it was like 80, 86, 87, she has an interview with Dr. Marion Craft where Dr. Craft is like, do you see any development in the last decade in white feminism, or has there been nothing, right? And Audre Lorde is like, let me tell you something, right? She's like, what did she say? She said something like, that I see that there have been changes. White women are beginning to recognize that Black feminism is not white feminism in blackface, that we have genuine, real difference, and those differences are important. And I see that, like, in that moment, she's reading them for Phil, but she's also saying, we have seen in this last decade this recognition. And I would say that one of the ways in which I think about that moment from Audre Lorde to the future is another Black queer woman who I think, 5 years after Audre Lorde's death, really came up with a piece that still explodes my world and I still think about all the time. And that's Dr. Kathy Cohen at the University of Chicago and her piece, Punks, Bulldaggers, and Welfare Queens, the radical potential of queer politics. And for those who aren't familiar, Kathy Cohen is a political scientist and explicitly says, what does queer organizing look like? She's like, I'm a Black queer person, although she says, I often don't want to be a queer anything, right? She's like, I feel like this is really a problematic phrase. But she looks at, what does it mean for working class Black heterosexual women to also find common cause and alliance with upper middle class white queer men? And she's like, let us imagine in these moments, what does queer politics and queer coalitions look like? And that would involve not suturing a superficial unity, but recognizing that those differences are real, but our differences are also what make us oppressed by larger state actors, right? By heteronormativity, by white supremacy, by patriarchy, and there can be moments of messy coalition. And so I often think of that piece as a sort of post-Lorde piece that still guides like the work and thinking I do today. And so I think that in that moment, going back to Audre Lorde's idea of difference being messy and terrifying, but also essential. You cannot look away from difference. And it means that I burn with a deep-seated rage anytime a well-intentioned person tells me that we need to emphasize unity. But at the same time, we need to also recognize that like that celebration of difference and that mark of that messy disconnect between me and every single other person in the Zoom box, because unfortunately, none of you are exactly like me, right? And yet we can find in that moment a radical moment of coalition building. And I think that's what she saw. And I think that is what keeps me from setting things on fire, also because that's illegal.
Thank you. Round of applause, virtual round of applause for Professor Tullis and Professor Tallie. Thank you for joining us, for being here.